There was a time when legendary studios dominated the gaming world. Troika Games, Black Isle Studios, ID Software, Valve. Some are still around, even if they refuse to count to 3. Yes, I'm looking at you, Gabe. Others were dissolved, absorbed, or scattered to the winds. And if you trace where most of those developers ended up, you'll find that most of them were acquired by big corpos that have little to do with gaming. Our very beloved gaming giants have been scooping up studios left and right, promising financial stability in an industry that's anything but stable. In theory, it was supposed to prevent mass layoffs, closures, and everything else. In practice, well, we all see how it is. And among the casualties of this corporate consolidation, one studio's fate hits particularly hard, especially for me. Today, I want to talk about Monolith Productions. On 25th of February, Warner Brothers have announced that it will be closing. And those are kind of news that make you feel less optimistic about gaming industry as a whole. It was never just another game developer. They were one of the few studios that dared to be different, infusing each game with distinct atmosphere, unique mechanics, and gameplay that stood apart from the rest. For younger gamers, they might be best known for Middle-earth Shadow of Mordor and Shadow of War, two games that not only brought Tolkien's world to life, but also did the unthinkable. They made orcs feel human. The Nemesis System was awesome, and we will delve deeper into it a bit later, but it made the world a breathing entity where enemies had history, grudges, and personalities. But Monolith was so much more than that. So, as the company is shifting from being one of the few existing great game developers to another tombstone in a graveyard of legendary game studios, I wanted to take some time with you today to just appreciate what they did and how they contributed to gaming as a whole, by reminiscing on some of their most iconic and interesting games. It all started, as expected, with the release of their first game, a typical shooter similar to others in its era, Blood. At first glance, Blood might just have seemed like another 90s FPS, in the same vein as Doom or Duke Nukem 3D. But to call it a simple clone would be doing it a massive disservice. Blood was something special, a game dripping with style, attitude, and an absolutely unhinged sense of chaos. It wasn't just about shooting enemies, it was about reveling in their destruction, cackling like a madman while entire rooms went up in flames. You played as Caleb, a gunslinging undead badass hellbent on revenge against the Dark God, and his fanatical cult, the Cabal. Let's be clear, Caleb wasn't your typical silent FPS protagonist. He was sarcastic, bloodthirsty anti-hero who quoted Evil Dead and The Crow, laughed maniacally as he torched enemies alive, and treated mass slaughter like a casual hobby. He was a perfect embodiment of Blood's over-the-top tone, and that tone, it was a love letter to horror fans. The game was packed with references to classic horror films. From The Shining to Nosferatu, you name it. Even the enemies felt ripped straight out of horror flick. Axe-wielding zombies, chanting cultists, gargoyles, disembodied hands that would choke you out, Evil Dead style. It all combined to create an atmosphere that was equal parts terrifying and hilarious. But it was more than just style, it played fantastically. Monolith pushed the build engine to its limits, delivering the tight shooting FPS mechanics, dynamic environments, and some of the most fun weapons in any 90s FPS. Dual-wielded flare guns set enemies ablaze, voodoo dolls let you kill from a distance, and bundles of TNT turned entire rooms into bloody messes. Every encounter was a playground of destruction, rewarding creativity and sheer brutality. Despite its cult following, Blood never got the mainstream recognition it deserved. Licensing issues meant Monolith lost control of the IP. While there were attempts to continue the series with Blood 2, it never captured the magic of the original. But in many ways, Blood set the tone for Monolith's future, a studio that wasn't afraid to experiment, to push the boundaries of gameplay and atmosphere, and to deliver something truly unique. And Blood was only the beginning. Monolith was about to prove they weren't just one-hit wonder. Next up, they released No One Lives Forever in 2000s, a game so ahead of its time that even today it remains one of the most criminally underrated FPS titles ever made. While other developers were chasing the grim military-style shooters of early 2000s, Monolith did what they always did best: make something unique. Instead of gritty realism, No One Lives Forever embraced vibrant colors, campy humor, and spy thriller setting that felt like a lost gem from a golden age of Hollywood espionage films. You played as Kate Archer, a British super spy working for a fictional spy agency called Unity, taking on global criminal organizations known as Harm, and if you think that sounds like James Bond-style adventure, you're absolutely right. But the game wasn't just that, it was packed with innovation. The gunplay was great, but what really stood out was the gadgets. You had the lipstick grenades, robotic poodles, sleeping gas perfume, a cigarette lighter that doubled as a welder. Every mission gave you something new to play with. and the game constantly encouraged creative problem solving. It wasn't just about shooting enemies, although you could do that too. You could sneak past them, eavesdrop on their hilarious conversations, or even distract them with coin toss, basically like playing a hitman, but as a woman. And talking about enemy conversations, No One Lives Forever might just have some of the best enemy dialogue in gaming history. Monolith didn't just program generic goons to stand around waiting to be shot. You'd catch them discussing workplace grievances, complaining about their love lives, even debating the merits of Swedish meatballs. And when you inevitably took one out, their body would actually notice and go looking for him. It was a small touch, but back then, not many shooters were doing something like this. For all its brilliance, No One Lives Forever suffered the same fate as Blood. Legal nightmares keep it locked away from current audiences. Between Monolith, Activision and Warner Bros, no one seems to know who actually owns the rights, and as a result, the game has been trapped in licensing hell for decades. There is no official remaster, and I wouldn't wait for it as well. Even more, you might not be able to find it on Steam or GOG, so for most of us, we would need to use some other methods. And yet, despite its relative obscurity today, No One Lives Forever cemented Monolith as one of the most creative studios in the industry. And you can take it from me that the game itself was quite amazing, and if you have a chance, you should play it even now. Before Monolith terrified players with F.E.A.R, they took one of the most iconic sci-fi horror franchises of all time and released Aliens vs Predator 2 in 2001. A game that didn't just live up to the legendary names it carried, it surpassed all expectations, and honestly, it probably still remains one of the best Alien and Predator games ever made. What really set it apart was its single-player campaign, because instead of just giving you the basic story, Monolith delivered 3 interconnected campaigns, letting players experience the game from completely different perspectives. You could play as a basic human, colonial marine, thrown into walking nightmare as your squad is hunted by both xenomorphs and predators. You could be a predator, stalking prey with advanced alien technology and hunting humans and xenomorphs like trophies, or you could be a xenomorph, starting a slowly facehugger before growing up into fully fleshed killing machine. This is probably my favorite campaign, quite honestly, since there are very little games even nowadays that give you this feeling that Alien campaigns, especially the first part of it, does. Each perspective felt wildly different. The Marine campaign was tense survival horror, where every beep of your motion tracker sent shivers down your spine. The Predator campaign was an ultimate power fantasy, making you into ultimate hunter, blending stealth and brutal melee combat, as well as a lot of technology. But Alien campaign was pure joy. There was something deeply satisfying about being able to crawl on walls, drop from ceilings and rip enemies apart with your claws. And unlike most FPS games of the era, AVP2 wasn't just about action, it had an actual story. Monolith crafted a compelling narrative that connected all 3 campaigns, with events from one storyline influencing the others. Marines you encountered as Predator, you might have played as them earlier. Areas you tore through as an alien, you might revisit them as a Marine, now seeing the carnage from different perspective. It was an incredibly smart way to immerse players in the world, making it feel dynamic and alive. Then there was a multiplayer. Long before asymmetrical horror games became a thing, Alien vs Predator 2 gave players the chance to battle it out in a deadly freeway war. Marines had firepower but were fragile, Predators had advanced tech but required patience, and Xenomorphs had speed and agility and the ability to see in the dark. Despite also being great, Alien vs Predator eventually fell into the abyss of abandoned classics. Licensing issues, again, meant it was never properly re-released, and today it's trapped in a limbo. But for those who did play it back in the day, it remains a shining example of how to handle a beloved franchise in the right way. By this point, Monolith had already built a reputation for creativity, versatility and innovation. But they weren't quite done yet, because just few years they would release one of the most terrifying and groundbreaking FPS ever made, F.E.A.R. You can also see a review of it on this channel, by the way. F.E.A.R wasn't just another FPS, it was an evolution of the genre. At a time when most shooters were either trying to copy Half-Life 2 or Call of Duty bombastic action, Monolith went into different direction. They asked a simple question: what if a first-person shooter could also be a horror game? The answer they gave was F.E.A.R, a game that blended hyper-responsive gunplay with psychological terror in a way that no other shooter had before. And if nowadays it's not so scary, back then it felt like Ravenholm from Half-Life but much better. On the surface, F.E.A.R looked like modern military shooter. You played as Point Man, a silent but deadly special forces operative sent to investigate a mysterious paranormal disturbance. And for the enemies, we had a rogue psychic commander and his army of clone super soldiers. Standard fare, right? No, because F.E.A.R didn't just throw enemies at you, it made you dread them. From the moment you stepped into the game, you were being hunted, not just by human enemies but by something else. A mysterious presence that stalked you from the shadows, flickered through your vision, and whispered in your ear when you were least expecting this. Her name was Alma, a ghostly barefooted girl in a red dress. Alma wasn't just a jump scare factory, she was an ever-present nightmare. She would appear in hallways just as you turned the corner, her shadow would stretch across the walls, entire rooms would distort when she was near. Even in moments of silence, you knew something was coming. But F.E.A.R wasn't just a horror game, it was one of the best feeling FPS games of its time. Monolith perfected slow-motion gunplay, allowing players to activate bullet time and turn every shootout into cinematic masterpiece. Coming after Max Payne and Matrix only helped this. But the main thing that was good about F.E.A.R was its AI. It's revolutionary. Enemies didn't just run at you, they flanked, they communicated, they reacted dynamically to your actions. Every firefight felt like tactical puzzle, where cover was constantly being shredded by bullets and explosions. And coming from Half-Life, where everybody couldn't even shoot while moving, this felt really good. The atmosphere was oppressive, the action was exhilarating, and the horror was great. F.E.A.R didn't just tell you a scary story, it made you live it. But if F.E.A.R was Monolith perfecting horror within an FPS, their next game took horror into the streets, stripped you of all your power, and made you feel the brutality of every encounter. Released the same year as F.E.A.R, Condemned Criminal Origins was completely different beast. While F.E.A.R gave you guns, slow motion powers and tactical combat, Condemned stripped you of all of that and threw you into the world where violence was intimate. You played as an FBI agent investigating a series of brutal murders, in a city that felt like it was rotting from inside out. But as Eden got closer to the truth, the city itself seemed to spiral into madness. The homeless turned into mindless killers, shadows moved when they shouldn't, and something far worse was lurking beneath it all. What made Condemned stand out was its focus on melee combat. Unlike traditional horror, games where you had an arsenal of weapons, here you were forced to scavenge for whatever you could find. Pipes, planks, crowbars, anything to defend yourself. Combat was so brutal, up close and ugly, every swing had weight, every hit was painful, and the game's sound design made sure you felt every crunch of bone and splatter of blood. And then there was atmosphere. Condemned didn't rely on jump scares as much, it suffocated you with tension. The game's environments, abandoned buildings, underground tunnels, ruined department stores were very oppressive. Every level felt like it was decaying, like something is wrong. And the enemies, they didn't just lunge at you, they stalked you, hid in the darkness, and waited until you least expected them. One of the most infamous moments in Condemned, the department store mannequin scene, is a perfect example. You walk into an abandoned shopping mall, mannequins are scattered around, lifeless, frozen in eerie poses. But as you move, something's off. The mannequins seem to be shifting, changing positions when you're not looking. Then suddenly, some of them move, and you realize that some of them are crazy people who are just posing to be mannequins. And that's Condemned in a nutshell. It wasn't just about fighting, it was about being afraid. The fear of what's around the next corner, the fear of what's watching you from the shadows. After many horror games over the years, older fans didn't expect Monolith to release games for which they're mostly known nowadays. Shadow of Mordor and its sequel Shadow of War, these games were very different from what you would expect. They weren't just another open-world action RPGs, instead, as is usual for the studio, they were redefining of what the genre could be. And in classic Monolith fashion, they didn't just iterate on existing ideas, they created something entirely new. The Nemesis System that I mentioned is what truly set this game apart. Like most open-world games where enemies were just nameless grunts, Monolith made them personal. Every orc in Shadow of Mordor had unique personality, voice, strengths, and weaknesses. Kill one, his underling might take his place. Lose to one, he would remember you, taunt you, and even adapt to your strategies. It was a system that made every encounter meaningful, turning what could have been another generic open-world grind into an experience where every battle felt like part of a larger, player-driven narrative. And it worked. Shadow of Mordor was a critical and commercial success, praised for its fluid combat, engaging story, and revolutionary AI system. It was a rare example of an open-world game that didn't just rely on scale, it relied on depth. Then came Shadow of War, which expanded on Nemesis System, introducing larger battles, fortress sieges, and even more dynamic interactions with enemy orcs. But here's where the things went wrong. The Despite Monolith's brilliance in game design, Shadow of War was ultimately tainted by corporate greed. Warner Bros. Forced microtransactions and loot boxes into the game, locking some of its best mechanics behind paywalls. What should have been another revolutionary step for the open world genre became yet another example of publishers prioritizing profit over player experience. Fans pushed back, of course, and Monolith, to their credit, eventually removed microtransactions in later update, but the damage was done. The Nemesis System, arguably one of the most innovative mechanics of the past decade, should have changed the industry. It should have been adopted, refined and expanded upon in countless other games. But again, Warner Bros. Had other plans. Instead of letting this groundbreaking system evolve, they instead patented it, effectively locking it away from the rest of the industry. No other developer could legally use or build upon Monolith's work, and what did Warner Bros. Do with it? Nothing. For years, Shadow of War remained the last game to feature the Nemesis System, a mechanic that could have redefined emergent storytelling. Instead, it was buried under legal paperwork, and now the studio itself has met the same fate. They gave the gaming world one of its best innovative mechanics, only to have it locked away. They gave us incredible games, only to be shut down by the very company that profited off of them. They pushed boundaries, experimented and took risks, only to be discarded when the corporate machine no longer had use for them. And with that, we come to the end of Monolith Productions. As I already said, they were never just another game developer. They were pioneers, risk takers, the kind of studio that refused to blend in. They crafted experiences that left a mark on players for decades, and now they're gone. Warner Bros. Shutting down Monolith isn't just another casualty in endless cycle, it's gut punch for gaming history. And the worst part, they didn't fail. They weren't shut down because their games flopped or because they lacked talent. They were shut down because in the modern industry, passion and innovation don't matter, unless the suits can squeeze out a guaranteed billion-dollar franchise from it. Because no matter how much a studio achieves, if they don't fit into corporate machine, they get discarded like yesterday's news. What makes this thing even more is that Monolith was still innovating, and all the players were excited to see what they could do. But instead, Monolith joins the graveyard of legendary game studios, buried alongside names like Looking Glass Studios, Bullfrog, Troika, Westwood, and Black Isle. A studio that once defined genres now reduced to nothing more than a footnote in Warner Bros. Earnings report. But Monolith's legacy won't be forgotten. Their games still exist, still playable for those willing to seek them out. Their ideas still ripple through the industry, their influence seen in the games we play today. And for those of us who remember, for those of us who played their games, we know what we lost. So here's to Monolith, to the risk they took, to the stories they told, and the games they made. They may be gone, but their mark on gaming is forever.